Ben bir mühendisim. Ofiste, evde, yaşamın her alanındayım. Görülmeyen ama hissedilenim. Ben ne kadar görünmez olursam, projelerim o kadar başarıyla tasarlanmış ve uygulanmış demektir. Tıpkı sizi sizden fazla düşünen gizli bir kahraman gibi. Kahramanlık, kağıtla kalem bir araya geldiğinde geleceğe yön verebilecek kadar cesur olmaktır. Çünkü mühendislik, bilim ve doğa alanında tüm bilinenleri yine doğa ve insanlık için kullanmaktır. Tasarımda sadece estetiğin değil, sürdürülebilirlik, enerji verimliliği, çevre duyarlılığı gibi kavramların da altını çizmektir. Mühendislik, modern, konforlu ve doğaya saygı gösteren yenilikçi yaşam alanlarını hayal etmek ve gerçeğe dönüştürmektir. Gelecek kuşaklara yön vermektir. Binlerce yıl önce bir kıvılcımla yaratılan aydınlığı bugün tek bir tuşla milyonlarca insanın yaşadığı yerlere taşımaktır. Geceyi gündüze, soğuğu sıcağa, sıcağı soğuğa çevirebilmektir. İnsanlığın ihtiyaçlarını karşılamak için hayallerimizi gerçekleştirirken yanımızda TTMD vardı. 1992 yılında kurulduğundan bu yana çatısı altında güven bulduğumuz, etik değerlerin teşkili ve temel sorunların çözümü için birlikte çalıştığımız yol arkadaşımız. Farklı disiplinlerden gelen profesyonellerin ortak amaçlar için toplandığı TTMD, üyeler arasında iletişim ve tartışma ortamı yaratıyor, bilimsel ve teknolojik yayınlar yapıyor, üniversite, sanayi, işbirliğine destek veriyor, çevreci ve enerji verimli çözümlerin yaygınlaşmasını destekliyor, yurt dışındaki gelişmeleri izliyor ve sektörü yurt dışında temsil ediyor. Bizler tüm insanlığın iyi yaşam arayışına çözüm buluyoruz. Bizler yarınlarımızı şimdiden kuruyor ve daha sürdürülebilir bir dünya için çalışıyoruz. TTMD, 1992'den bugüne yaşam mekanlarında insanlığın konfor ihtiyaçlarını doğaya saygı göstererek sağlamak için var. Mühendislik mesleğini etik değerler doğrultusunda uygulamak için var. Türk Tesisat Mühendisleri Derneği. Gelin geleceği birlikte yaratalım.
Okay. Dear participants, welcome to the webinar organized by ASHRAE Turkish Chapter and Turkish Society of Heating, Ventilating and Air Conditioning and Sanitary Engineers. Although I have been appointed as a moderator, but I'm unable to perform my duty because I have contracted COVID disease. I apologize for everyone, to everyone for not being able to perform my duty. Moderators are Mr. Atilla Büyükoğlu, he's president of ASHRAE Turkish Chapter, and Mr. Meriç Sapçı, president of Turkish Society of Heating, Ventilating, Air Conditioning and Air Sanitary Engineers, and Mrs. Deniz Yılmaz. Thank you for your understanding. Okay, you turn, Mr. Meriç Sapçı.
Okay. Thank you very much hocam. Değerli dinleyiciler, bugün çok değerli bir konuğumuz var. Dr. Stephanie Taylor. Kendisi Harvard Medical School'dan mezun bir tıp doktoru ve bizim mesleğimiz için ilginç bir özelliği daha var. O da Norwich Üniversitesi Mimarlık Bölümünden yüksek lisans diplomana sahip olması. Uzun yıllar doktor olarak çalışıp aynı zamanda da enfeksiyon hastalıklarının kapalı ortamlarda kontrolü üzerine hazırladığı teziyle Norwich Üniversitesi Mimarlık Bölümünden yüksek lisans diplomasını da almıştır. Bir tıp doktoru olarak Dr. Taylor özellikle kapalı ortamların insan sağlığı üzerindeki etkilerine dair çalışmaları ile biliniyor. İç ortam hava kalitesi ve ortam bağıl neminin enfeksiyon hastalıklarının kontrolünde nasıl etkili olabileceğini gösteren çalışmalarını mesleki olarak yakından takip ediyoruz. Yaşamı boyunca hastalarının daha hızlı iyileşmesi ve bu bakım sürecinde hastanelerin işletme maliyetlerinin de azaltılması için sağlık bakım yerlerinin fiziksel ortamını ve klinik iş süreçlerini iyileştirmeye odaklı çalışmalar yapmıştır. Nature, Science ve diğer hakemli dergilerde çok sayıda araştırma ve çalışmaları yayınlanmıştır. Yaşadığımız COVID-19 küresel salgın sürecinde de bir tıp doktoru olarak Dr. Taylor'ın kapalı ortamların insan konforu, sağlığı ve verimliliği üzerinde çalışan, hizmet veren bina makine mühendisliğinin önemini devamlı bir şekilde vurguladığını görüyoruz. Halihazırda kendisi ASHRAE Salgın Hastalıklar Bilim Kurulu üyesidir ve ASHRAE seçkin eğitimcilerinden biridir. Dr. Taylor, thank you very much for joining us on today's webinar that is presented by the cooperation of TTMD, Turkish Society of Heating, Ventilating, Air Conditioning and Refrigerating Engineers, and ASHRAE Turkish chapter. We are very excited and happy to host you here virtually. By the way, I would like to Dr. Kemal Sevindir, because you know he got sick in a few days ago. Then all of us, including Deniz Hanım and Atilla Bey, try to fill in for him. We all wish Dr. Sevindir get well soon. Now I am handing over the microphone to Dr. Atilla Büyükoğlu. Please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Melis Sapçı. Ben de Türkçe devam etmek istiyorum. Bu etkinliğin ASHRAE Turkish Chapter ve Türk Tesisat Mühendisleri Derneği tarafından gerçekleştirilen bu etkinliğine, ortak etkinliğimize hoş geldiniz demek istiyorum. Ayrıca bu Türk Tesisat Mühendisleri Derneği ile ASHRAE Turkish Chapter'ın ilk ortak aktivitesi, işbirliği sonucu olarak bu etkinliği sizlere sunuyoruz. Bundan da gurur duymaktayım. Bu etkinliğin ileriye yönelik devam etmesini diliyorum. Dr. Stephanie Taylor iki konu başlığı sunacak sizlere. Engineers are the physicians of the future and healthcare associated infections and hospital indoor air quality. Bu konuşmaların içeriği hakkında birkaç ipucu verecek olursak, kullanıcı sağlığı ve iç ortam hakkında yeni verileri ortaya çıkaracak ve iç mekan hava yönetimi hakkında ve yaşanılan alanların tasarımı, yüzey temizliği konularında önceden bildiklerimizi değiştirecek bazı bilgiler içeriyor. Çevremizin hastaların iyileşmesi üzerinde ne kadar önemli etken olduğunu, dolayısıyla iç hava yönetiminin önemli olduğu hakkında bilgileri kendisinden alacağız. Bu vesileyle bu etkinliğin sonunda Dr. Taylor'ı değerlendirmeniz için sizden bir anket çalışması talep edeceğiz. Mail olarak size anket gönderilecek ve toplantı bitiminde bu anketi cevaplayıp gönderirseniz çok memnun oluruz. Yes, I want to introduce Dr. Stephanie Taylor. You can start your presentation. Thank you, Dr. Stephanie.
Thank you so much, and I am honored to be here and honored to be speaking to the ASHRAE Turkish chapter. I have no idea what you've already said about me, but hopefully it's all okay. So I will begin my presentation. And again, I will try to speak clearly. And if you have any questions or don't understand a point, please let's go over it in the discussion portion of this presentation. So I will begin. Let's see. Get this a little out of the way. So I firmly believe that anyone in the building industry, whether you're an engineer, an architect, a builder, a building owner, that the future of public health really lies on your shoulders now. And you will understand why I firmly believe that as we go through this presentation. So engineers are the physicians of the future, and also we're going to talk a little bit about how the hospital environment affects patient outcomes, but we're really not going to spend too much of our time talking about hospitals and patients, because what we have found originating with research in the hospital building and how the physical environment impacts patient healing, we're finding that those same trends affect all of us in all different building sectors. So while my work originated through my being a physician and taking care of patients in hospitals, again, the bulk of my presentation is going to be to show you information that applies to all people in all buildings. So I hope that you find that interesting and relevant. So to get started, again, I think I've already been introduced, but my primary professional love in life is medicine. However, at some point in my career, I realized how incredibly important buildings are to human health. So that's why I expanded my work. I became an architect, and now I work a lot in research. I work with ASHRAE. So I've kind of bridged between medicine and the built environment at this point. So in the next, I don't know, 50 minutes or so, I'd like to talk about these three topics. One, how the relationship between human health and indoor environments is not straightforward. It's not as clear as we perhaps would like to think. Secondly, I'd like to talk with you about how, as building professionals, you can begin to see and evaluate indoor spaces through the lens of human health. So this is deviating somewhat from only thinking about energy consumption, although that clearly is very important. I'd like everyone to move beyond thinking about buildings as for their real estate value and really see them as shelters primarily. And then at the end, I'll touch for a moment on the business case for evaluating and managing buildings through this lens of health. Because in my experience, unless you can show a building owner or manager the profitability of taking care of the people inside, whatever you say is not going to gain traction. You know, people will say, yes, we should be doing that. But unless it's profitable in some way that is clear to whatever group you're speaking to, you're not going to get adequate traction. So at the very end, I'll talk a little bit about how we can begin to balance energy consumption and human health, and how we can show the profitability of the health aspect. So I hope that sounds interesting. So to get started, I'm going to tell you a little story about how I, Stephanie, as a physician, or before that as a medical student, began to bridge from medicine to building science. So this is me before my hair turned gray. This is when I was a medical student. I was at Harvard, and I decided I wanted to have an adventure. So I went to Papua New Guinea for 4 months, and it was an amazing experience. I lived in these villages and interacted with the people who lived in New Guinea. I worked in a hospital. And this was my main hospital for 4 months. It was called the Wewak General Hospital in Papua New Guinea. And you can see the surface hygiene wasn't, it didn't appear to be that good from my perspective. The photo on the left shows the men's tuberculosis ward. They had pretty good ventilation with open slats. You can see the concrete floor. However, the beds were pushed quite close together. In the middle, you see a gentleman in bed with his son. Families would help take care of the patients. And then the image on the right shows me actually in an operating room. I have flip-flops or sandals on my feet, which is what everybody wore. The nurse did not have gloves on. So when I saw this in New Guinea, I thought, oh my gosh, these patients are going to get all kinds of infections and they're not going to do that well. But to my surprise, and I kept very careful records, these patients did well. They did not get extra infections. They went home when we thought they would. So I was really happy about that, but I was surprised. And then I came back to Boston, to the Harvard hospitals, where you can see this is a patient room. All the rooms were single, they had private bathrooms. However, in the United States, going into the hospital before COVID-19 anyway, it was the third leading cause of death. Going into the hospital, totally separate from the reasons you went into the hospital. And the main cause of that high mortality rate are infections that patients were getting during their time in the hospital. The gentleman in the middle happens to be the dean of my son's medical school. He was skiing, he hurt his knee, so he went in to have supposedly a one-day procedure. He came out 4 months later without his whole leg from a MRSA infection, and he almost died. The little girl on the right is one of my oncology patients who survived her leukemia, survived chemotherapy, and almost died of an infection. So I was again perplexed. Why in New Guinea, when things didn't look that clean, were people not getting infections to the same extent? And yet in the United States, where things looked very pristine and sterile, infections were a big problem. So this made me worry that there was something else going on that we weren't considering. And again, this is me when I was in medical school, talking with one of my professors, who's a chief of surgery, who was a brilliant man, absolutely wonderful, wise. And so all of you who think about mentoring students, I'm a big supporter of that. But Dr. Folkman told me, as a student, never underestimate the role of the environment. So this was the beginning of my wanting to better understand the built environment. So speaking of that, and so ultimately I went back to school and got my master's in architecture and engineering and learned how to design hospitals. But let's take a look at, over time, the relationship between humans and our shelters. So a long time ago, we lived in shelters where we had lots of communication with animals, soil, outdoor plant, and water. We built much more sophisticated buildings over time. Our building materials became more able to withstand tension and compression. We developed sanitation systems. And really by the 1900s, most people were living and working indoors. And then fast forward to 2022, before we all started working from home anyway, many of us worked in buildings that were sealed, lots of recirculated air, unable to open windows in many cases. So our buildings became beautiful and very sophisticated. However, surprisingly, we've also seen an increase in certain kinds of diseases. We've seen an increase in many categories of infectious diseases, despite antibiotics and treatment. We've seen a rise of antibiotic resistance. But we've also seen an increase in a lot of diseases that are related to inflammation. And some of these are not intuitive, in my opinion. For example, we now know that heart disease is related to particles exposure in the air. It's also related to what you eat, your genetics, and how much you exercise. But there's a really significant association between your exposure to air compounds and inflammatory-based diseases, including cardiovascular disease, even things like diabetes. We're now finding associations with components in the air. So as we think about this trend, that despite increase in sanitation systems and many categories of medication, we're still seeing a rise in certain disease categories. So we need to take a look at and ask ourselves, is there in fact an association between how we're managing our buildings and these changes in diseases? Because now, or starting 2 years ago, we're dealing with COVID-19. And interestingly, and I don't expect everyone to become a microbiologist, but I do want you to think about this point that I'm about to tell you. In the course of human disease, all of the viral respiratory pandemics have been caused by the same family of virus. It's called the single-stranded RNA virus. The Spanish influenza was caused by a single-stranded RNA virus. SARS-1, MERV, COVID-19, and all the ones in between that are respiratory viral pandemics or epidemics have been caused by this type of virus. And the reason that's relevant is that a single-stranded RNA virus mutates very quickly and easily. So when this type of virus divides into two virons, lots of genetic mistakes are made, and they're not corrected. So compared to, say, double-stranded DNA, which is the genetic material of humans and many other organisms, double-stranded DNA organisms repair their mistakes. But single-stranded RNA viruses, such as the SARS-CoV-2, it doesn't have that proofreading capability. So as a consequence, if that virus finds a new indoor environment or a new environment in which a strain can now habitate, and it finds a host that doesn't have immunological defenses, you have a pandemic. So what this means, when we're thinking about single-stranded RNA viruses, we need to make sure that we manage our environment correctly so we don't force more infectious strains, and we need to think about how the indoor environment is affecting human immunity, our own immune system. So there are two sides to this. There's the virus, in this case indoors, how many are airborne, but there's also the human being. We want to make sure that we're managing our buildings to support the health of the human being, as well as to diminish the potential harm from indoor viruses or bacteria. So if you think about it, we spend most of our time indoors. I mean, I live in a beautiful part of the United States, lots of mountains, I hike, etc. But I'm still indoors more often than I'm outdoors. And again, what I can see is not the whole story, because a lot of the things in our environment that we cannot see are very impactful to our health. They can make us tired, they can increase our vulnerability to infections, they can contribute to allergies, skin disorders, autoimmune diseases like ALS or Lou Gehrig disease, as we call it in this country. There are many aspects of our health that are impacted by the indoor environment. It's not only comfort. I mean, comfort is great. We want to be comfortable, but we also want to be healthy. So I want to take a minute here to show you this video. So with new tools that originated in medicine when we wanted to understand the genetic basis of many diseases, the same genetic analysis tools have shed much more information on our indoor environment. So this video, it's an animation that's based on data. So as I'm sitting here in my office talking, little droplets come out of my airways about 100 microns in diameter. Those droplets contain all the normal viruses and bacteria that are in my mouth, my nose, my airways. That's normal. This engineer is working away on her desk with paper, and you can see she is shedding particles from her skin. You can see some particles coming from her nasal passages, from her nose. That's normal. That's not wet. She's not dripping. Those are just dry particles. Her digestive system is illuminated because we have lots of particles and bacteria and viruses in our GI tract. So the point of this is to show you that human beings have a very active interaction with the environment. And I also want you to be sure to remember that surfaces and the air are very much connected. We don't live in a two-dimensional world. We live in a 3D world. So things that are on surfaces go up in the air, things that are in the air land on surfaces. And then at the end, depending on how sealed our buildings are, you have more or less exchange between ambient outdoor conditions and indoor conditions. So I just want you to think about that. I want you to think about this relationship between human beings and the building. And if any of you don't like germs or think that all germs are bad, I want you to to reconsider that notion. Most of these things are good for us. Most of the bacteria and viruses that we live with actually help us survive. We couldn't live without them. But clearly, there is some percentage of bacteria and viruses that make us sick. So we have to think about how does the built environment affect this proportion of good versus bad microbes. And in fact, it's absolutely fascinating. Each of us human beings is about 70% bacteria by cell number. So not by volume, obviously, we're about 2 gallons or let's see, what's that, about 8 liters, I think, of bacteria by volume in each of our bodies. And we shed about 37 million microbes into the air every hour. I mean, that's a lot of microbes. But again, most of those are good for us. But the thing is that's really makes what we do with buildings so important is that how we ventilate, how we design, use, and ventilate our buildings will actually create conditions that allow for the survival of certain types of bacteria and viruses and fungal organisms. So if you think about that, it means that our built environment is now the most powerful evolutionary force that is affecting the microbes that live in our buildings with us and which have a very powerful impact on our health. The microbes in our body help us digest food. They help us, they send chemical signals that affect our thoughts, our moods. The bacteria that are on our skin and in our digestive systems actually determine who we will find attractive and who we might marry. So pheromones that our body secretes are really determined by the organisms. So if you think about that, then we're all sort of like, you know, matchmakers, I guess. But these organisms are important for every aspect of our life. One of the things we've learned from taking this new approach to understanding how bacteria, viruses, and fungal organisms live on our bodies, we've learned that, again, most of these microbes are good. They help us survive. So we've kind of moved away from this attitude that all bacteria are germs, they're all bad, we need to take massive amounts of antibiotics and just kill them all. We need to disinfect surfaces with strong chemicals. That's actually incorrect. And this might be a little bit hard to think about during a pandemic when we're clearly struggling against a pathogenic virus. But I want you to remember that not all organisms are bad. In fact, if you try to continually eradicate all organisms, what you really do are remove the good ones and allow the pathogens, the disease-causing microbes to increase in proportion. So we want to be really careful. At times, it's very appropriate to try to clean all surfaces and to clean them thoroughly, such as in an operating room or in a burn unit, for example. However, in our daily lives, in most environments, we don't and can't eradicate all organisms. So we want to be careful about how we think about this balance. And in fact, those of you who love animals or love dogs might already know this, but dogs actually carry very healthy bacteria. The communities are called the microbiome of our bodies or of your dog. So dogs actually have very healthy microbes. So while you might not want your bed to look like this, it's probably not the end of the world from a health perspective. Cats are a different story, but we're not going to talk about cats right now. So here we've learned that the indoor environment is very powerful in terms of our health, and yet this is the problem. Architects and engineers and builders have one type of learning, one set of vocabulary words. You know, their world is in one very highly educated silo. Compared to medicine, which again, we have our own vocabulary, we have our own way of thinking and analyzing and categorizing diseases. But unfortunately, even though the indoor environment is very important for our health, it's really hard for us to talk to each other. And because of that difficulty, I eventually went back to architecture school because I realized I didn't know anything about buildings. And the facility managers, the building managers of hospitals, they didn't know how to talk to me. I didn't know how to talk to them. I actually think they turned the other way when they saw me coming. So eventually that's to understand these two worlds is why I went back to school. And it's been very, very rewarding. But how do we bring these two professional silos together? So how do we bring building management where we're focusing on reducing energy use? We want to build buildings that have codes so that we don't have catastrophic fires or earthquakes or damage from floods. And in medicine, we want to heal patients. We want to follow the right protocols. And if you live in a country or with a network where lawsuits are rampant, like in the US, as a doctor, you don't want to get sued, so you want to do the right thing. But we're thinking, building folks and doctors are thinking about different things. But what we really need to do is learn to unite these two silos so that we can put human health in the center of building management. That's my belief and conviction, why engineers are the physicians of the future. But how do we do that? How do we shift from seeing buildings more from a real estate perspective and an energy perspective? How do we begin to see them and analyze them from the perspective of human health? So if you lived in a country where there was lots of coal mining, at least in the old days, the coal miner would send a canary into the mine shaft before they went in, because canaries, that type of a bird, has a very high demand for oxygen. So if the canary went into the mine and came back out alive, the miners could assume that they would be okay. So this is one strategy, but we can't really send birds into our buildings to determine whether the indoor environment or the indoor air quality is appropriate. So what else can we do? So this is the first study that the first big study where I was able to directly look at the relationship between patient outcomes and the patient room environmental metrics. So this study, this was in a brand new hospital in the Chicago area of the US. A beautiful hospital, LEED silver, all the rooms were single with private bathrooms. So we looked at these metrics that you see listed in the middle. We measured these things every 5 to 30 minutes for a little bit over a year, for about 13 months. So we just had a huge number of data points from the built environment. So we had temperature, hand hygiene, room pressurization, lighting, CO2, humidity, room traffic, room air changes, and outdoor air fractions. So we took all of that environmental data and related those data points to patient infections. So we are trying to say, is in fact there a significant relationship between the patient room environment and the surrounding nursing station areas? Does that truly impact patient outcomes? So we sent a massive amount of data off to our statistician, who came back and said, yes, there is a relationship. So I thought, okay, so it'll be hand hygiene, or maybe the number of visitors in a room will be related to infections. But in fact, it was a huge surprise. Our statistician came back and told us that the most statistically significant driver of infections in the patient in the hospital was low relative humidity in their patient room. I did not believe this at first. We reanalyzed the data, more studies have been done, and in fact, this relationship holds true. So if you look on the x-axis down here, you can see that when the relative humidity, so not absolute humidity, and this isn't around dew points, it's around, unfortunately, it does include the temperature, and I know that creates a more variable analysis, but when the relative humidity was less than 40%, especially with respiratory and gastrointestinal infections, the infection rate was high. So, and as the indoor, not outdoor, but as the indoor relative humidity approached 40%, the infection rate came down. Now, if you're looking at this green line, that represents urinary tract infections. So those had more to do with whether or not a patient was in a wheelchair or was incontinent. So the green line wasn't related to the environment. Again, that was more other factors, but gastrointestinal, respiratory, skin, and eye infections were higher when the relative humidity indoors was lower. And over 60%, we again saw the infection, some infections begin to go up again. So what's going on? Why is relative humidity, indoor relative humidity, important in infections? So before we talk about that, I just want to point out this study, which was over a year, was incredibly labor intensive. And we can't analyze all buildings with this same degree of work. And in addition to that, at least in the United States, in areas where the climate outdoors is cold, or with certain types of building envelopes where you might have leaky air, cold air from the outside coming in, there's no way you can safely humidify the indoor environment to 40%. Because you would have dew points, you would have liquid water forming from condensation. So we need to manage relative humidity to keep it in this good range if we can. But what happens if we can't? And what about all the other pollutants that we know come indoors or are created indoors? What about particles? What about gases? How do we bring those into this equation? So what I want to talk about now with you is why and how these other components are so important for human health. And that if we can begin to look at our buildings from the perspective of occupant health, we will learn new things. Just like we've learned that all microbes are not bad, we've learned that relative humidity in this 40 to 60% range is very good for our health. What else? What other relationships exist between humans and the indoor environment? So this is what I've been working hard on now. I was working on it before, but now I'm working on understanding this relationship in a way that's more scalable. So what I have found with my work is that there are 11 essential indoor metrics that are key to human health. So these metrics, they include temperature, humidity, particles, nitrous dioxide, sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, ozone, and CO2. These are kind of like the bare bones essential indoor metrics when you want to evaluate human health. But it's not only the individual gases or particles that impact the human being, it's also how those components or how those indoor constituents interact with each other, sort of like the indoor chemistry and the secondary compounds. Because we now know that not only the microbes that are indoors with us, not only particles, temperature, humidity, and gases, they affect our respiratory system, they affect our cardiovascular system, and they affect our thinking. Pretty much all categories of diseases are impacted by by the indoor environment. So how can we understand what to do to support human health? So again, what I've been doing is work now to monitor these 11 different things that I just listed for you on a continuous basis and understand how to then remediate buildings in a way that's realistic for that climactic zone. So let's start with relative humidity. So this will be a little bit of a review since we've already talked about relative humidity. Why does it matter for our health? We all know that heat we can feel, or the temperature, sensible heat, affects our comfort. And ASHRAE, for a long time has talked about comfort and building occupants. COVID-19 has made us all start thinking about how the indoor environment affects our health. And I'm glad that we are now thinking about it. I'm not glad that we have a pandemic, but I'm glad that we're thinking about how the indoor environment affects our health. And we now know that humidity or latent heat goes beyond comfort and affects our health. So when the relative humidity is low, our skin barriers don't work as well. Our respiratory immune system is not as functional, as well as our whole body is affected by even very slight dehydration. So for example, we know that when you're 1% dehydrated, say 2 o'clock in the afternoon and you've been working away, maybe drinking coffee, you've been urinating more than you would without coffee, maybe you haven't been drinking enough water, it begins to affect your brain. You become tired, it's harder to concentrate. You're probably, let's see, it's 3:30 where you are. So many of you might be around 1% dehydrated and not feeling quite as well as you were this morning. So that's the human body. What about relative humidity in the indoor environment? Why does that matter? We all know that high relative humidity, especially if you have a cold surface or if it's cold outdoors and you have a thermal channel in your building envelope, you run the risk of liquid water from condensation and you run the risk of mold. And I'm not exactly sure what the climate is right now where you all are, but you may be thinking, we do not have a problem with dry air. And I understand that in many areas of the world, in many climates, dryness is not a problem. It's the other end of the spectrum. But a lot of people are oblivious to the fact that if you cool your air, so if you have mechanical air conditioning, you cool the air when it comes in down to whatever the design temperature is, 50 degrees say, and then warm it back up again, you can still have low relative humidity indoors. Why does that matter? Well, we now know that when the humidity is low, the viral particles that we breathe out, that we exhale, are able to stay in the airborne environment for longer. When you humidify, you increase the so the hygroscopic particles attach to water molecules and they become heavier and settle out of the environment. We also know, and this is absolutely crazy, but we now know that, first of all, 80% of viruses become inactive. This is that study was done with influenza virus, but even the coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-1 and 2, are relatively less infectious. Not only are there fewer of them in the air, but they're actually less infectious when the relative humidity is in that 40 to 60% zone. We're still trying to figure out exactly the mechanisms of that, but that finding is holding true. So in addition to the actual infectivity, you're all probably aware of how antibiotic resistance, which doesn't affect viruses, but it affects bacteria. Antibiotic resistance, which has resulted in methicillin-resistant Staph aureus or MRSA and other superbugs, are something that is a big problem in the world. We now know, as of 2018, that when bacteria are in the air, so in a dry airborne environment, we now know what you're seeing on the right here. So these little green spots are bacteria in the air, and they can actually sort of gobble up or bring into either into their cytoplasm or into their nucleus. They can bring fragments of things that are in the air. So for example, this is especially important in a hospital because we now know that antibiotic resistant genes can be spread through the airborne environment. And the World Health Organization has, again, this is prior to COVID-19, but the World Health Organization stated that the spread of antibiotic resistance is one of the largest challenges to us as human beings. So now we're finding out that antibiotic resistance is not only spread through the overuse of antibiotics, but we now know that antibiotic resistant genes are also spread through the air. So we need to be very careful about how we manage our hospitals and all of our buildings so we don't create conditions in which these genes are spread. And one of the ways we can do that is to maintain that proper humidity level. So what about relative humidity and your immune system? Why does it matter? So the first line of defense against a viral infection or a bacterial infection, or even against particles being inhaled into our bodies, is the mucous membrane that lines our eyes, our nose, our throat, and our respiratory system. And when the humidity indoors, when the humidity that we breathe in is low, we tend to dehydrate the mucus level, and the little hairs called cilia that wash things away from our lungs can't work. So this barrier system that's produced by a healthy respiratory mucosa becomes less effective. And when you don't have this mucus barrier, pathogens and particles can go through the cells of your airway and penetrate into your bloodstream, and in some cases cause blood infections known as sepsis. So the point of this slide is to tell you that we need a hydrated mucosa in our nose, our sinuses, our airways, our eyes, to protect the rest of our body. And what about our skin? This again is data that's absolutely so important and so surprising. We now know that your skin actually produces cortisol. We used to think that all the cortisol or cortisone in your body was produced by your adrenal glands, which are on top of your kidneys. We used to think that all cortisol came from the adrenals. We now know that your skin, when your skin is stressed by either UV light or low relative humidity, not high humidity, so if you exercise and perspire, you don't have to worry. But low humidity stresses your skin, and the dermal cells, not the very top layer, but the next layer down, actually can synthesize cortisol, which is an immunosuppressant. So when your body is exposed to harmful indoor conditions, your skin is producing an immunosuppressant that's going to make you more vulnerable to infections and certain malignancies. So again, it just goes to show how important our environment is. Okay, what about gases? How do gases affect our health? So carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, volatile organic compounds from off-gassing, ozone, how do these things affect our health? Why do they matter? Well, it ends up that if you are in an environment with even imperceivable levels of outdoor pollutants from combustion, such as NO2 and SO2, or if you're in the presence of ozone, which can either come from indoor electronic equipment or comes in from the atmosphere, these compounds cause inflammation of your respiratory system. And so when the cells become inflamed, they become more leaky. And not only are these gases able to enter your body, but they increase your vulnerability for infections. So again, where do gases come from? How do they get into our indoor environment? You know, there are lots of outdoor sources, and there's some indoor sources. And again, as I told you, if you inhale some of these gases, especially the combustion byproducts, as well as ozone, you increase the inflammation in your airways, making you not only sick directly from that, but from an increased risk of penetration by bacteria, viruses, and particles. You don't want that to happen. What about our brain? Well, you may already be quite aware of this, but when the carbon dioxide level, which is usually a proxy for ventilation, but when CO2 rises, you can become sleepy, you can get a headache. Carbon monoxide binds to your blood and prevents the transport of oxygen. These gases cause a lot of neurological symptoms. Okay, now let's talk about particles, and then we will talk about what to do. So why do particles matter? Well, they do, and you are probably aware of this. There's different sizes of particles. There's the ultrafine, fine, and then what are called coarse particles, depending on their size. The number of particles in the air, many of which come in from the outdoor environment, can not only be harmful in themselves, but they carry other components like viruses, like antibiotic resistant genes. So ultrafine particles can penetrate directly from your respiratory system into your blood. You definitely do not want that. The 2.5 micron diameter particles are the ones you probably heard the most about because there are clear associations between high particle levels and health problems. Again, the number of particles in your space and the gases and the temperature and relative humidity will also affect the microbes that live indoors with you. So you want to create an indoor environment that's healthy both for the people and for the microbes. If you hear drinking, that's my dog drinking. So again, all of these different indoor components can be brought in from the outdoors or introduced by indoor processes. And you want to make sure that you're managing your building to only promote the good ones. Respiratory health, we've talked about this already. The smaller particles can penetrate more deeply into your lungs. The bigger ones get caught further up. You don't want to have harmful particles penetrating deep into your tissues. What about particles in your heart? We now know that heart attacks and strokes are worsened when you have particles in the air. And again, I feel like you may know some of these points of information, but women who live in areas that have high levels of outdoor air pollution and indoor contamination actually deliver babies more often. The delivery ends prematurely and the babies can have lower birth weight. So again, even not only for ourselves, but for the next generation, we want to manage our buildings appropriately. So how do we do this? How do we understand what's going on and how do we remediate? And meanwhile, you might be thinking, well, this is great. You know, it's wonderful. Yeah, we all want to be healthy. But what about energy consumption? And what about outdoor pollution? Do we have to choose one or the other? Are we really in a tug of war? Or can we find strategies to both decrease fuel consumption and create indoor environments that are healthy? So what I've been finding in my work is really pretty interesting. That if what I've been finding and how we are now approaching the buildings that I work with, if you understand how these indoor compounds interact with each other, so if you're not only looking at particles by themselves, or if you're not only looking at relative humidity or gases, but if you look at how these things interact with each other, and then how the primary and the secondary compounds affect the body, you not only have a more complete understanding of the human health impact, but you also have choices with remediation. So for example, say you have high volatile organic compounds in your building, say from off-gassing from carpets or furniture. Perhaps you don't want to rip out the carpets. Perhaps you don't want to get a whole new set of furniture. So what else can you do? How do these other indoor components affect VOCs? We now know that if relative humidity is high, you have increased off-gassing. So if you can't rip out your carpet and change the furniture, you can decrease your relative humidity and control the off-gassing for the period of time that it takes for the VOCs to come down into a healthy zone. So by understanding how these compounds interact, you can have a more complete and flexible remediation system. So again, in my work, we have created a single health impact number. And then from that number, you can drill down into the data and understand the compartments, the particles, the gases, the thermal conditions, and then you can remediate flexibly. So again, you might be thinking, is this really profitable? Can we really do this? Will we do this? Will building owners and managers put the resources into managing buildings for health? Because sometimes people say, nope, you know, we're not going to do it. However, and this is a United States-based slide, but if you're a research animal in, say, the NIH, at the NIH animal facility, you're going to be in a great environment. The humidity is controlled, the particles are controlled, gases are controlled, because if you die, you're going to cost that study a lot of money. Or if you're an astronaut in outer space, you can believe you're going to be in a great environment because it's so expensive to keep you up there. Or if you're a famous painting or book or musical instrument, you're going to be in a well-humidified, excellent environment. But what about the rest of us human beings? What if we're not a famous painting or not an astronaut, or what if we're not a research animal? Do we deserve to have our environments managed for health? So this is my son and me in just prior to the pandemic. We were hiking in Peru. We were up kind of in the middle of nowhere, as you can see. My son is now an emergency room physician. Very proud of him. But anyway, so my son and I were hiking, kind of again in a very remote part of Peru. And we came upon this little mausoleum. I hope this doesn't bother anyone listening. We came upon this little stone building that had corpses inside. So we went in and we were looking around, and you can see there's a humidifier, dehumidifier down here on the floor on the lower right-hand side. And there's a hygrometer and thermostat on the left. So eventually the building manager came in and I asked him what his goals were for this mausoleum. And he said, well, we try to keep the relative humidity in the mausoleum between 40 and 60% because the corpses do better. And I thought to myself, we don't want to wait until we're corpses to manage our buildings. We don't want to wait until we're dead to manage our indoor air appropriately. And again, how do you create a return on investment business model to show building either policymakers or building owners that it actually is profitable to take care of the people? And one of the ways you can show the profitability of managing indoor environments for human health is to expand your business analysis to include the productivity or the well-being of people. So for example, if you are a commercial business owner or if you lease space to businesses, think about the costs of employee absenteeism. Or think about the cost in decreased productivity when people aren't feeling well, if they're tired, or if they're not coming to work. So when you do your business analysis, expand your focus to include the human being. In schools, poor air quality reduces standardized testing scores by a measurable amount. So temperature, humidity, particles, and CO2, when those things are out of range in an unhealthy way, student performance is measurably affected. And in one environment in which the outcome of good or bad indoor air is very clear is in the senior living space. Elderly folks are very vulnerable to air pollution, as well as to overly dry air. Skin is thinner and there are often a multitude of comorbidities. But these are building types where you can create a business model to show whomever you're speaking to that it really is profitable to manage the health of human beings. And another concept that appropriately is getting much more attention is the concept of environmental equity. So for disadvantaged groups, in the US, for example, the Environmental Protection Agency says all people deserve to have an indoor environment that supports their health. So what this means is if you're very elderly, or if you're pregnant, or if you haven't even been born yet, you need protection from the indoor environment. In addition, there are certain diseases that have a genetic component, such as sickle cell anemia. So African American, especially men, have a increased risk, an increased incidence of carrying the sickle cell anemia gene. And if you do, your response to air pollution will be much more exaggerated. So when you think about health equity or environmental justice, we've got to really begin to think about how the indoor environment can help or harm these different groups in the population. So in summary, how am I doing time-wise? I hope you're all listening. We now know that by giving visibility to the health impact of the indoor environment, you have a database, a scientific basis for managing indoor air quality to support health, productivity, and learning. And if you understand not only the individual metrics indoors, such as particles and temperature and gases, humidity, if you understand not only those individual metrics, but how they interact with each other in indoor chemistry, and if you understand the impact of the secondary compounds as well, you'll have a much more complete idea of how your building supports human health, and you have flexible remediation strategies. And finally, healthy people do increase the profitability of businesses and the success of the human species. So I want to end with this slide, which is a little bit embarrassing. This is me in both sides. I like to skydive. And about 2 years ago, one of my jumps, my altimeter wasn't working correctly. And so I was off by about 200 feet. So the point of this is, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So I couldn't accurately measure my altitude. So when I came in for a landing over here, I was too low. So when I did my final base, I'm sorry, my downward base and final legs of landing, I came in too fast. And as you can see, I landed right in my face. I did a really terrible landing. It was very embarrassing. I didn't get hurt. So if you can't measure your altitude, you're not going to have a very good landing. And conversely, over here, my altimeter was working fine. I knew exactly what altitude I was at, and I was relaxed and having a great time. So if we want to understand the impact of the indoor environment on human health, we have to think about it, we have to measure it, and we have to manage it. So thank you. I'll stop talking now, and hopefully there'll be questions or comments, or people will argue with me or whatever.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stephanie. Please accept our sincere appreciation for the outstanding presentation you made, and also thank you very much for sharing your time with us. Now we can take the questions. I will ask the questions respectively that came during the presentation. First question is, if the humidity level higher than 60%, is it necessary to decrease the level for health?
I'm not surprised at that question. That's a great question. So if you're thinking about infections, when the relative humidity exceeds 60%, we see a slight increase in infectious disease transmission. And we think the reason for that is when the humidity is high, you have more surface transmission, but you don't have more transmission through the airborne environment. So while high relative humidity can be uncomfortable because you don't lose heat as rapidly, high relative humidity can obviously cause problems in a building with moisture. And you do see an increase in some contact or surface transmitted organisms. So if it is over 60%, if you can bring it down, you should. But it's really the low relative humidity that we haven't addressed from a health perspective. Most people think that the drier the better indoors, but in fact, that's not the case.
Okay, thank you very much. And the other question is, what kind of relation is there between ALS disease and IAQ?
I'm sorry, what was the first one? The first part?
What kind of relation is there between ALS disease and IAQ?
I'm not sure. Oh, ALS, the autoimmune disorder?
Yes.
Oh my gosh, great question. Wow. I'm really pleased by that question. So we now, in medicine, we think that there's sort of a continuum between what can start out as an allergic disorder, so exposure to something outside of your body that attaches to your body, whether it's a virus or a particle or a bacterial infection, and then your immune system gets confused and begins to think that the normal cells in your body are foreign. And so this is sort of the underpinnings of an autoimmune disorder. So while we are seeing cohorts of ALS patients in certain geographic areas, which points to an environmental component, we think that the link between autoimmunity and the environment is through this pathway where you're exposed to something in the environment, your body recognizes that exposure as foreign and harmful, but then your immune system continues to fight your own cells. So I hope that makes sense. So if your immune system is confused and starts fighting your motor neurons, you know, that's ALS. Or you may be familiar with Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is more common and not as devastating because most people recover from Guillain-Barré syndrome. It's a neurological deficit. It's not as severe or deadly as ALS. I hope that answers that question.
Okay. I would like to ask another question. I read an article where you made a relationship between bats and relative humidity and COVID-19. Can you say something about this?
Wow, you guys do your homework. So my point of that article is that one of the big differences between, well, there are a couple of differences between bats and human beings, clearly. But one of the differences in terms of viral infections is that bats can live with a virus. Bats live with a lot of viruses in their bodies and they don't become devastatingly sick. So that's one point of difference. The other thing is we now know that what happens with people who get very severe symptoms to COVID-19 is that the levels of interferon that are produced by your respiratory cells are diminished early in the course of disease. So compared to a bat, bats have very high and appropriately responsive interferon production as they're exposed to viruses. And the people that get really sick have a delayed interferon response. And so the purpose of my column was to say that if you're number one in a good humidity zone, you have more interferon and more appropriate interferon production. Number two, bats are clearly exposed to a lot of different bacteria, many of which actually support their immune system. So I wanted people to understand again how important managing humidity is, so that, especially to avoid low humidity, by pointing out that even things like interferon production in your respiratory system are related to the amount of water vapor in the air. Oh my gosh, I'm very impressed.
Thank you very much. Dr. Attila, Mr. Meriç, would you like to ask any question?
Yes, I have a question, Dr. Taylor. Based on your research and knowledge as an ASHRAE Epidemic Task Force member, which indoor air quality technologies should be considered to help decrease the spread of COVID-19 in built environment?
Oh, again, great question. So to think of, when I think about infections indoors, I think about the environment, the infectious load in the building. And we now know that the air is a very important transmission pathway. So I think about the infectious load and I think about the vulnerability of the human being. In ASHRAE, most people don't think about the human being so much. So the technologies to reduce viral loads indoors that I think are effective are, one, filtration. You know, again, we recommend MERV 13 filters if you can do that. If your outdoor air condition if you're not in too polluted an area, you know, increase your ventilation. Hopefully you can do that without expending lots and lots of energy on heating and humidification. Ultraviolet, UVC, if you're careful about not exposing human beings, UVC is associated with decreasing the infectivity of viruses and bacteria, both the upper room UVC irradiation, as well as in the ductwork to keep fan coils and filters clean.
Mm-hmm.
So when I think about UVC, I think that I advocate making sure that you are very thoughtful about it, that you don't just leave the UVC units on more than you have to, because we don't want to, don't forget, we don't want to kill everything. We just want to decrease the load of pathogenic organisms. So I am a proponent of UVC, but I think it has to be used thoughtfully so that we don't increase viruses and bacteria that become resistant to shortwave ultraviolet light. So UVC, filtration, ventilation, there's some other technologies out there. The whole bipolar ionization is a bit controversial right now because of possibilities of ozone production as a secondary byproduct. That's still kind of being tossed around, and ASHRAE does not recommend bipolar just because we haven't seen enough peer-reviewed papers about it and the concern that there might be harmful byproducts. So ventilation, filtration, manage your humidity, and UVC is effective. As well, manage your surface hygiene as well. But don't use chemicals that are going to produce VOCs.
Yeah, but I would like to ask one more question. If we increase the fresh air ventilation, and it is going to be costly in wintertime, for example, what about the clean air ventilation? If you compare fresh air ventilation, and fresh air is necessary for cognitive functions of us. And what about the clean air ventilation against the COVID-19 or other pathogens?
So do you mean clean air, meaning like air that you have filtered and processed?
Yeah, filtered.
And recirculated?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so that's why I think that monitoring and measuring is really important, because you can see if in fact your recirculated air is supportive of health. You can, with monitors, you can see if the particles are decreased. You can see if the gas levels are appropriate. But I agree, if it's cold outdoors or if it's polluted air outdoors, you don't want to be bringing that into your building for different reasons. So yes, recirculated air, if it's properly filtered and cleaned, that's a very good approach.
Yeah.
So we talk about now in ASHRAE, as I'm sure you know, we talk about not just air change rates, but effective air change rates. So if you're treating your air, your effective air change rates can be higher than your actual volumetric air change rates. I think you know all this.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
I always get nervous when engineers start talking to me about engineering.
Yes, Dr. Stephanie, I have one question. You showed us a figure that it shows the relationship between relative humidity, the other metrics. Most of them decreases, but urinary tract infection always increases. So,
yeah.
What's the reason? Or
Again, you're very good listeners. You're very astute. I'm impressed. I don't think anyone's ever asked me why urinary tract infections go up. And
very pleased to meet you. We would like to see you again in our other events, hopefully in person. And we have an organization this September in Istanbul, but it's going to be online. And we would like to see you this symposium, international symposium, online. And if you accept to join this symposium, we will be very happy and pleased.
thank you. What are the dates of your symposium?
End of the September. And we would like, we can send you another our invitation.
That sounds great. I think I would probably be available and I would be honored to participate.
Thank you very much.
You're a wonderful group and thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
One more question, Deniz. Please read this question.
First, very long question. Sorry.
Did you see? From Neil Avner-Çikurel.
Yes.
You see?
Thank you to the thank you to the organizers for this wonderful and educative event. I have one question. Even though the efficiency of UVC is proven by countless scientific papers and researchers, we see in many places like Johns Hopkins recommendations that UVC should be avoided, or many times we see HEPA filters being favorized compared to UV. We can't argue that HEPA has a positive impact on IAQ while this UV.
So
UV doesn't affect the it's a very long question. Doesn't affect IAQ, but it is a much more energy efficient system. What is the reason HEPA is shown as a superior method?
So I'm not sure I totally understand, but they're comparing UVC to HEPA filtration?
Yes,
and they're saying UVC is less effective than HEPA?
Yeah, I think it means like this. What is the reason HEPA filter is shown as a superior method, he is saying.
Oh, superior to UVC?
Yeah.
I don't know that study. ASHRAE recommends, MERV 13, which is not as stringent as HEPA filtration, but I don't know why. I don't know that study. I'd be more than happy to take a look at it and respond offline through email. But I don't want to say an incorrect interpretation because I don't fully understand the study. So I apologize, but I can't answer that well right now. If that person could email me, I'd be happy to read the study and have a conversation about it. It sounds like whoever asked that question might have an opinion about it, though. Is that true?
Yes.
Do you have my email address? And please feel free to share it with attendees, and we can continue to have conversations.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, we are going to share your mail to our attendees, and then if somebody has some questions, and he can write it directly to you.
Okay.
I think I'm seeing the question now in the chat. Yeah, would that person please email me? Because I would like to be able to answer it or to talk about it. I must say, your group has asked the best questions I think I've ever been asked.
Okay, I think that's all. And I think there is no more questions left. And again, we would like to thank you. And it is the morning time, and it is very early for you, and for participation this afternoon meeting in Turkey. Okay.
It was my pleasure.
Okay, thank you very much.
Take care. Thank you.
Okay. See you.
All right. So are we ending now?
Yeah. I think yes. There is no
Okay.
more question.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You